The thrill-seekers couldn't shake the eerie sensation that clung to them as they crept through the twisted landscape of the abandoned freak show. What they'd expected to find was nothing more than rotting wood, tattered posters, and rusted cages. Instead, each tent and exhibit seemed preserved in chilling detail, as though the show had only closed the night before. As they walked past the entrance tent, they spotted the Freak Hall marquee, a sign painted in blood-red letters that read, "See the wonders of the world, a place for the twisted and the damned." Beneath it, dim carnival lights flickered in time to an unseen rhythm, casting strange shadows that danced across the worn ground. They took tentative steps forward, eyes darting from side to side as they moved through the narrow alley of tents. The first cage they came to held the three-armed lady. Her face was almost skeletal, skin stretched thin over prominent cheekbones, and her hair fell in stringy, matted clumps around her shoulders. Her third arm protruded unnaturally from the center of her back, and she held it out as if offering a grotesque welcome. She was frozen in place, her eyes wide with an expression of horror, lips sewn shut with thick, crude stitches. Her fingers were twisted and gnarled, each knuckle enlarged to the size of a walnut, as though from years of pulling and scratching at the bars that held her captive. "Do you think she's real?" Sarah whispered, trembling. She can't be," Jason replied, but his voice lacked conviction. As they inched past the cage, the friends noticed a faint wheezing sound. They peered closer and realized with horror that her chest was moving. She was breathing. Her sewn lips quivered slightly, her hollow eyes fixated on them, pleading for release or perhaps warning them to turn back. But they were already caught in the eerie pull of the place, unable to turn away. They moved to the next cage, which held the man with 1,000 voices. He was hunched over, his back grotesquely bent, arms hanging limply by his sides. His mouth stretched impossibly wide, frozen in an expression of screaming agony. He looked like he'd once been a strong, proud man, but his muscles had atrophied, leaving him gaunt and hollow-eyed. As they passed, the air filled with whispers, faint, disembodied voices calling each of their names. Jason, Sarah, Lily. The voices echoed, mingling into a chorus that twisted around them like a creeping fog, taunting and laughing. It was as if every voice he'd ever spoken still lingered inside him, trapped and tormented, spilling out into the air. Lily's heart hammered in her chest, and she clung tightly to Sarah's arm, her knuckles white. As they ventured deeper, they found more grotesque figures in each cage. There was the Serpent Woman, her skin marked with scales that glistened like a snake's under the dim light. Her eyes were unblinking, slitted like a reptile's, and her tongue darted out periodically, long and forked. She was coiled up in a cage barely large enough to hold her, and her limbs bent at impossible angles, wrapped around her torso in a contorted embrace. Her gaze was as cold and venomous as the creature she resembled. They passed by a cage labeled the Hollow Twins. Inside were two small, childlike figures who shared one body but had two heads, each with hollow, empty eye sockets, devoid of any emotion. Their faces were twisted into haunting smiles, yet something in those smiles was deeply, chillingly wrong. They swayed in eerie unison, whispering indistinguishable words that sent shivers down the friends' spines. Each whisper seemed to sink into their minds, filling them with memories that didn't belong to them, memories of lives spent caged and forgotten. Suddenly, they were drawn toward the largest tent at the end of the row. A thick curtain of velvet hung over the entrance, frayed at the edges yet rich with a dark, wine-colored hue. As they stepped inside, the scent of damp earth and stale popcorn filled their nostrils, mingling with the faint tang of something metallic. The main tent was arranged like a circus ring, cages forming a full circle around them. But these cages were larger, each housing a singular figure in even more grotesque forms than before. One figure wore an elaborate jester's costume, bells on each corner of his hat. Yet his face was twisted into a silent scream. Another was The bearded giant, his thick, wiry beard reaching down to his knees, binding his limbs together like vines that had grown over him. His face was hidden behind the tangled hair, but his eyes burned with a fierce hatred, fixed on the newcomers as though he was deciding which of them he would consume first. Then came a voice dripping with malicious glee from the shadows beyond the cages. "We've been waiting for you." The friends spun around looking for the source but saw no one. The lights overhead flickered, casting unsettling shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, making the figures in the cages appear to move. And then, from the far corner of the tent, stepped the ringmaster, a figure dressed in crimson and black with a top hat cocked at an odd angle. His face was painted in white, his eyes sharp as daggers, and his grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Welcome to the show," he purred, his voice echoing through the tent. "We're always in need of fresh attractions." As the friends backed away in terror, they found themselves surrounded. The figures in the cages had somehow emerged, their grotesque, misshapen bodies moving in unnatural jerks, as though they were being puppeteered by unseen strings. One by one, the friends were grabbed, cold, bony hands pulling them into separate cages that snapped shut with a final metallic clank. "Don't worry," the ringmaster whispered, leaning close to each cage. "The audience loves a good scream." With a flick of his hand, the lights dimmed, leaving only the flickering bulbs around the cages. The friends could see each other's horrified faces, hear each other's cries and gasps as the ringmaster laughed, stepping back into the shadows. Outside, the freak show remained hidden in the fog, waiting for the next thrill seekers to wander in and take their place among the exhibits. The marquee lights continued to blink in rhythm, and the whispers of caged souls drifted out into the empty night, calling for new visitors, new exhibits to entertain their endless, twisted audience. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat. Mark had rented the old house for the summer, a crumbling, ivy-covered property with thick stone walls and narrow windows set deep in their frames. It was just the place to escape the city noise and finally finish his novel. The house was tucked away in the countryside, surrounded by trees that swayed ominously in the evening breeze, but he welcomed the isolation. The silence, he thought, would be the perfect companion to his work. One evening, after settling in and unpacking his things, he wandered around the yard, taking in the tall, tangled grass and scattered garden stones. His gaze fell on an old well near the back of the garden. It was built of thick stones covered in moss, and the well cover was heavy, cracked in places but sturdy looking. The ground around it was cold, almost damp, as if the earth clung to some forgotten chill. "Guess you've seen a lot," Mark mused, patting the old stones. For a moment he thought he heard something echoing from inside the well, but he quickly brushed it off as the sound of water at the bottom. With a shrug, he went back inside. That night, Mark sat at his desk, typing away, his only light a dim lamp casting eerie shadows across the walls. But as the clock neared midnight, he heard it, a faint, distant sound that rose and fell like whispering. At first he ignored it, thinking it was the wind moving through the trees. But the sound persisted, and soon it felt as though it was coming from inside the walls. When he finally got up to investigate, he was drawn out to the garden, his bare feet padding over the cold grass until he stood in front of the well. The whispers were louder now, coming from deep within the stone walls of the well, resonating in a haunting, unnatural way. "Hello?" he called down, his voice wavering. There was no reply, but the whispering continued, sounding like multiple voices tangled together, each just barely intelligible. He strained his ears, catching broken words that sent chills up his spine. "Help, trapped, alone." "Hello?" he called again, feeling absurd for speaking to an empty well. But this time, he heard a reply, a faint, breathy voice calling his name. "Mark." He staggered back, the hairs on his arms standing up. He hadn't told anyone in town his name. No one even knew he was here. His rational mind insisted he was tired, stressed, that his imagination was simply playing tricks on him. But the voice, there was no mistaking it. His name, carried on a breath of cold air, seeping up from the darkness below. That night, sleep evaded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the whispers, growing louder, pleading. The voices grew sharper, as if pressing against his mind, leaving him restless, eyes wide in terror. Morning brought little relief. The whispers faded with the dawn, but a sense of unease lingered. He tried to shake it off, returning to his writing, yet he couldn't get the voices out of his mind. Every so often, he glanced out the window toward the well, feeling its pull like a silent, relentless call. Days passed, and the whispers became more frequent, more insistent. The voices were no longer faint but spoke clearly, weaving together tales of lives cut short, of secrets buried in the dark. They described an old village that had once stood where the house now stood. Each night they told stories of betrayal, of strange rituals performed at the well, and of bodies that were thrown down into its depths, never to be seen again. Driven to the edge of sanity, Mark found himself returning to the well each night, as if drawn by an invisible force. He lowered a flashlight into the depths, hoping to find some logical explanation, but the beam only illuminated endless darkness. Then one evening, the voices changed. They no longer called for help, but instead began demanding something, their tone sharper, darker. "Join us, Mark." His hand shook as he gripped the edge of the well, peering down into the inky blackness. His heart pounded in his chest as the voices seemed to pull at him, coaxing him to climb over the edge, to lean just a little further. The next morning, Mark awoke on the damp grass beside the well, his hands scraped and bruised, and his memory a haze. The whispers had grown more insistent, and he realized he had been sleepwalking toward the well. Over the following days, his mind began to fray, the voices driving him mad with their relentless calls. One stormy night, as lightning illuminated the sky, Mark found himself at the well again, the voices calling out louder than ever. Rain poured down, soaking him as he clung to the edge of the well, staring down into its darkness, where the voices rose in a cacophony of screams and whispers. "Come down. Come down." He felt himself slipping, his body leaning forward against his will. Just as he began to tip, lightning struck a nearby tree, the sudden light jolting him back to his senses. He stumbled back, panting, but the voices didn't stop. They only grew louder, their cries echoing in his ears, clawing at his mind. Desperate to silence them, Mark picked up a nearby rock and threw it down the well. The voices stopped for a moment, a brief silence that hung in the air before a cold, mocking laugh rose from the depths. "You cannot escape us, Mark." The laugh twisted, transforming into a chorus of shrill, piercing screams that echoed up from the well, so powerful that he staggered back, clutching his head. The next morning, he packed his things in haste, determined to leave the house, the whispers haunting him with every step. But as he reached the end of the driveway, he found the road blocked, the old, overgrown trees seeming to close in around him, leaving him trapped. And then he heard it. A familiar, chilling voice, whispering from behind him. "Mark, come back." He turned to see the well standing in the distance, shadows twisting around it as if alive. He realized, with growing horror, that he could never leave. The house, the well, and the voices were all bound to him now, their stories forever etched into his mind. Jake had taken the job at the fire lookout tower to get away from the noise of city life. The tower sat high above the forest, isolated and quiet, perfect for clearing his mind. The only sounds were the occasional crackling of the radio and the wind rattling against the glass. One night, close to midnight, Jake noticed a thin line of smoke rising through the trees in the distance. Strange. He hadn't seen any storms or lightning that could have started a fire. He grabbed his flashlight, put on his jacket, and descended the steep metal stairs into the cold night. As he walked toward the smoke, he kept glancing over his shoulder, feeling the hairs on his neck prickle in the eerie silence. The smoke was coming from deeper in the forest than he'd initially thought, and each step took him further away from the comforting sight of the tower's light. After 20 minutes, he reached a small, makeshift campfire pit, smoldering with no one in sight. Around it were signs that someone had recently been here: footprints, some old scraps of clothing, and an empty can of food lying nearby. Uneasy, Jake turned to head back to the tower, feeling eyes on him even as he left the site. Back in the safety of the lookout, he tried to calm himself. Maybe it was just some hiker who had gotten lost, left the fire burning, and moved on. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A sudden rustling outside jolted him upright. He grabbed his flashlight, aiming it at the window, catching only the swaying branches and a glimpse of shadow that darted out of view. He stepped outside onto the small deck that circled the tower. The night was unnervingly quiet, the moon casting an eerie glow on the treetops. Just as he turned to go back in, his beam caught something at the base of the tower. A figure staring up at him. Jake's heart pounded as he squinted, trying to make out who or what it was. The figure stood motionless, half hidden in the shadow, but the faint outline of a bulky jacket and boots were visible. The man was too far to see his face, but his posture was wrong. Too still, too deliberate, as if he'd been waiting. Trying to keep calm, Jake turned back into the cabin, locking the door behind him. The radio crackled to life just as he settled down, giving him a momentary sense of relief. But as he scanned the frequencies, a cold chill settled over him. There was no message, no chatter, just dead air. Then came the sound of footsteps echoing up the metal stairs outside. They were slow, deliberate, each step measured, and dread filled Jake's chest as he realized the stranger was climbing up. Jake moved quickly to the door, bracing it with his shoulder, but the footsteps kept coming. He could hear heavy breathing outside now, and a faint scratching as though something sharp was being dragged along the metal railing. Jake's mind raced. He'd left his phone down in his truck and the radio was useless. All he had was his flashlight and a small hunting knife tucked away in his pack. He grabbed the knife, clutching it tightly as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, a shadow appeared through the frosted window on the door, a large, hulking figure with a hand pressed against the glass. The man leaned in, the shadow shifting as he peered through the small window, his face obscured but close enough that Jake could see his breath fogging up the glass. "Come on, let me in," a low, gravelly voice murmured from the other side, barely above a whisper. "Just want to talk." Jake's pulse hammered in his ears as he braced against the door, knowing that if the man decided to break it down, he wouldn't be able to hold it for long. He glanced at the small emergency axe hanging on the wall. Quietly, he reached for it, keeping his eyes fixed on the window. After what felt like an eternity, the shadow shifted, and the man backed away from the door. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, but he stayed where he was, waiting, listening. He could hear the faint scuffle of boots moving around the outside of the tower, the occasional scrape of something sharp trailing along the wall. Then came a loud bang on the opposite side of the cabin, as if the man were testing every possible point of entry. Each bang echoed in the silent night, rattling the thin walls and making Jake feel trapped in his tiny fortress. Suddenly, the footsteps returned to the stairs, each one growing fainter as the man descended back to the ground. Jake sagged against the wall, relief flooding over him, but his relief was short-lived. Outside, below the tower, he saw a flash of movement. Someone else was joining the man, stepping out from behind the trees. Another figure, tall and slender, moved up beside him. And then another, and another. They were circling the tower now, the moonlight casting their shadows in long, distorted shapes across the forest floor. Jake counted 5 of them, all dressed in dark clothing, each one holding something metallic that glinted in the light. One by one, they began to climb the stairs, spreading out along the steps, each one ascending at a steady pace, no longer in a hurry. Jake's hands shook as he backed up to the far side of the cabin, knowing that if they made it to the top, there would be no way out. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, and Jake felt the full weight of terror settling over him as he realized there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. And then the handle turned,